Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me in the back row there? Okay, awesome. So it is 7 o'clock, and this is great to see a full house here, which we really need because the heater isn't working to its fullest capacity in here. And so we have a lot of people walking here saying, oh, it's a little cool, but once you get it packed with warm bodies, it will feel very cozy and comfortable. So thank you for providing the heat for the building. We really appreciate that. My name is Joseph. I'm the director of the Cowlitz County Historical Museum. We have a really exciting program here tonight about the 1962 Columbus Day storm, but I'm going to start off with a couple of quick announcements here. Actually, just two quick things. We have a membership drive going out. Many of you have probably received the membership renewal form, and there's a couple changes in it. One of them is that you'll be receiving your membership card in the mail after you turn in your form with your check if you choose to renew your membership. But we also have a change in that the contributing level membership is now called sustaining level, and at that level and above you can take advantage of being part of our network with the North American Reciprocal Museum Association. And so this form also came in there that explains the benefits of NARM membership. So the Cowlitz County Historical Museum is now a member of NARM, and any NARM affiliated museum that's in this country will honor your Cowlitz County membership card at that sustaining level and above, and give you the benefits as if you were a member there, as far as admission prices are waived, discounts at the gift shop, and also member-only events will be offered for you. And so you can look at the NARM website, which is on this form, and it has a map, and you can look at all the different museums that are members of NARM. Also take your enhanced card with you if you're traveling, because there are museum members throughout the country. Last year I was in Palm Springs with my mom. There's a Palm Springs Art Museum. I think it's $14 to get in the door. I had a NARM enhanced card from another organization, and they let my mom and I go in for free, and then my mom got the membership discount at the gift shop. So if you use it a few times, especially at some of these art museums where they're $14, $12 a pop to get in, it can pay for itself. So please consider the, if you haven't upgraded your membership to the sustaining level, this is a good thing to consider, especially if you travel or you're up and down Highway 5 and you're in some of the larger cities that have other NARM affiliate members. So that's something that we're excited to offer. The other announcement is next month we are going to have the third installment of John Simpson's Civil War Letters program coming in, so that will be on the 7th of March. I always forget that March is almost always the same days as February, because of the nature of February actually making sense for a month. So on that note, I'd like to invite our speaker here, John Dodge, who is he was a columnist and editorial page writer and investigative reporter for the Olympian prior to retiring in 2015 from an award-winning career that spanned 40 years. He and his wife, Barbara Digman, live in the Olympia area and enjoy gardening, bird watching, hiking, reading, and traveling. And that's what my wife and I enjoy doing too. My wife's an avid birder, and we have a place that's actually not too far where John has a place. So it's nice to make connections with a neighbor, even down here in Cowlitz County, that we have so many common connections. So without further ado, I'd like us to give John a warm welcome here, and thank you again for coming tonight.
Everybody, are we on? Okay. Well, what a nice crowd. It's great to see so many faces, and I see, when I ask this question, I think I know the answer. How many storm survivors in the room? Yeah. Well, that's been happening as I tour around with the book, which came out in October, published by Oregon State University Press, all throughout Oregon, the Willamette Valley, the coast, southwest Washington, Puget Sound, and all the way up into Vancouver Island in British Columbia. People that lived through this storm have never forgotten it and never will. Before I get started, I do want to do a little shout out to the folks here at the museum. Joe has been a gracious host. Jim has helped get me set up tonight, and Bill Watson, your collections curator, was very generous with photos from the collection here, and they're sprinkled throughout my book, and the price was right. I think all I had to do was donate a book to the museum, so that beats the Oregonian, where they wanted $150 per image. So anyway, newspapers are in tough times, so they're trying to make a buck every way they can. What I'm going to do tonight is run through a PowerPoint presentation with the nuts and bolts of the storm, some of the questions that are commonly asked, and some images. I'll interrupt it a couple times with some brief readings from the book, 2 or 3 times, with a Kelso long view connection in the book. And then I'll leave plenty of time for questions, and hopefully I'll have the answers. And I did bring some books, and I'd be happy to sell them and sign them after the program. And I do have a square reader, and so you don't even have to have cash. Okay, well, enough of the marketing. I'm much more comfortable just talking about the book and sharing the story of the book with you. We're looking at the cover, and I'm going to get back to that in a bit, but let's move right into some of these images. Here's some basic facts about the storm. I searched far and wide to make sure that first statement is accurate, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't been disputed yet. Strongest windstorm in West Coast recorded history. Covered 75,000 square miles from Northern California to Southern BC. We have at least 63 direct and indirect deaths, and when I say an indirect death, I mean someone that suffered a fatal heart attack trying to put their antenna back on their roof, or bucking up fallen trees on their front yard, or some sort of secondary after the storm had passed type incident. But they probably wouldn't have died if the storm hadn't happened. And then there's very many, over 45 direct deaths where people were struck by flying debris, falling trees, electrocutions, those sorts of things. Serious injuries means someone was hospitalized. 53,000 homes damaged or destroyed. That's a Red Cross figure for the states of Washington and Oregon. Does not include BC or California. Total property damage is a little bit hard to get a firm, accurate number on, but, and by the way, I'm using 2017 dollar values with these. When you see a dollar figure, it's been adjusted for 55 years of inflation. So at least 2 billion, and probably more like 5 billion especially when you include tree loss. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a minute. This is an interesting slide in showing, oh, I went too fast. This shows you some of the peak wind gusts in our area, the path of the storm. The center of the storm is that yellow line, and the low pressure center of the storm, which was very much a tightly formed cyclonic event, much like a hurricane, but not by definition a hurricane. You can see a lot of 100-mile plus figures. Let's see, what do we have for something closest to Kelso? It looks like down on the harbor. Nassau, the Air Force Station in Nassau was 160 miles an hour. It looks like around 90 in the Kelso Longview area. A lot of 100-mile-an-hour readings down in Cape Blanco near the southern Oregon border. That 145 is at the Coast Guard station there, and it says plus because they know it was stronger than that because the wind gauges blew away in the middle of the storm. So there was no accurate record of just how hard it blew, but there are estimates of anywhere from 170 to 200 miles an hour. You know, just incredibly fierce gusts of wind. This isn't the sustained winds, but it's the gusts. And really ground zero was the Willamette Valley, the Oregon coast, the Willamette Valley, and southwest Washington. So what makes this storm so strong? Well, here I have to delve into some. I wish George Miller was here. I just turned the program over to him for 5 minutes. But anyway, the storm's low pressure system was moving in a south to north trajectory, and it was very close to land compared to our other extratropical windstorms that we get, which then positioned the strongest winds over our most populated regions in the Oregon and Washington areas. And then the upper atmospheric and surface winds were both blowing from the south, so they were mixing and enhancing each other along the front of the storm. The speed of the storm added to the surface winds. This storm was moving at 40 to 50 miles an hour, which in and of itself is a pretty strong wind. You think about a hurricane on the East Coast or in the Gulf, where they're so slow moving, 6 to 10 miles an hour. Here we're really cooking. There'd been a lot of heavy rain in the days prior to the storm, saturated the soil and made a lot of the trees more vulnerable to wind. And like any living creature, a storm like the Columbus Day storm goes through a cycle of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and death. And when it was making landfall right here in our area, it was at the powerful prime of its life. Here's the house. Whoops, boy, this thing really wants to jump fast. Here's the house I was sitting in the night of the storm. It looks worse than I remember, but it is pretty. I'm going to see if I can get the. I don't know if I can get the. You can see there's a family room window right there. And there's about 10 of us, 2 families huddled in there watching this thing unfold. Not very smart. We should have been deeper into the house, away from glass, away from windows. No one was hurt, but the house, it was a friend's house, not our house, suffered a lot of damage. And we were there because my parents thought our house, which was in the woods, would have been less safe than this. So, didn't quite work out. Now here we're going to go all the way back across the ocean to the Marshall Islands and look at the birth of a typhoon, which became much of the fuel for the Columbus Day storm. Typhoon Frida, which was commonly misspelled with an I. It does not have an I. And the numbers you see are dates in October, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and on, as it marches across the Pacific Ocean as a typhoon, which is a Pacific Ocean version of a hurricane. So it was a hurricane all the way until, I believe, somewhere between the 9th and 10th of October, when the winds finally dropped below 74 miles per hour. But it still was a vigorous storm, a powerful storm that held together, parked itself off the coast of Northern California on the 11th, and mixed with warm air from the south and cold air from the Aleutians, and re-energized into what's called a mid-latitude storm, a mid-latitude cyclone, or an extratropical cyclone. That's the type of windstorm it was, fueled by differences in pressure and air temperatures. And there was a typhoon tracker, an airplane from Guam that had followed it for several days, and the crew had said, you know, this thing doesn't look like it's breaking up, but their superiors back in Pearl Harbor called or radioed them back and said, no, come on home, it'll dissipate, nothing to worry about. Well, guess again, huh? Some of you, how many of you are tuned in the early 60s to Portland media? How many remember Jack Capel? Well, Jack is kind of a protagonist in my book. Jack was a well-respected weatherman. KGW TV and radio. And he was the only forecaster that went out on a limb and said this is going to be the strongest windstorm that we've ever seen or in recent history, urging people to get somewhere safe and secure. He made his forecast at 5:15 on Friday afternoon. By then, much of the Willamette Valley had been blown apart. So, but he was reporting to his Southwest Washington and Portland audience, and I think he made a difference. He probably saved lives. People took him pretty seriously. But I get a kick out of the graphics he has to work with compared to today. The old easel board and write it on there every day and just basic information. And that, in fact, was the case. They had very little to work with as far as forecasting this storm, predicting its strength, seeing it out there in the ocean. It was kind of unseen except by radar, U.S. Navy radar picket ships that were really out there looking for Russian submarines, because we're in the peak of the Cold War. 10 days after this storm, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I digress. Anyway, Jack is an interesting character in the book. And I did have a chance to interview Jack a couple different times when I do anniversary stories about the storm prior to his retirement. There's a storm damage in Newport where the winds were in Yaquina Bay, blew mist off the bay up into the air up to 100 feet, and people were plucking seaweed off their windows a half-mile inland. There weren't that many boats sank, just a couple small boats, large fishing fleet there. Most of them either double and triple tie downs at the docks, or they went up the river to up toward, is it Toledo? The nearest town up the river from Newport to avoid the direct onslaught. Back to the cover. This is Campbell Hall, Oregon College of Education in Monmouth, near Salem, Oregon. Oldest public college building in Oregon. The tower didn't do too well that afternoon. A student with a keen eye and a good photographer had 4 exposures on his box camera left when the storm hit, and he'd taken 3 shots already before the tower collapsed, and he realized he'd better hang on to that last exposure because he could see that it was starting to wobble and then rewrite itself and then tilt a little more, and finally he caught it just as it's headed for the ground. And that became the shot seen around the world, the iconic photo of the storm. He sold it to Look magazine, Look or Life, I always get it mixed up, for $400, which is a lot of money in 1962. That's like almost $3,000. And he said, I went out and I bought a new camera and a stereo, and I had the nicest stereo and camera of any student on campus. And classic right place, right time. Now we're moving over to the Oregon State Hospital in Salem. This Superintendent Dean Brooks was the fellow that allowed the cast and crew to film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest at his hospital, which was in the mid-1970s, based on a book written by Ken Kesey, The Year of the Storm, 1962. Well, here he is the day after, trying to help with some repairs on the main building at the hospital, and the night before during the storm had been a very chaotic place with power outages and patients in the maximum security ward jumping out of windows, breaking arms and legs. A couple people were killed with trees falling on them, heart attacks. somehow he managed to keep some semblance of order there with a overcrowded hospital, something like 2,500 to 3,000 patients in a hospital built for less than 1,000, which has a kind of a familiar ring, doesn't it, when we talk about our mental health institutions. So anyway, he was a colorful fellow, and when I interviewed him, he was still living within shouting distance of the hospital, 2013 or 14, and he had some memories. He was 96. He passed away about 6 days after I talked to him, and my dad, with his dark humor, said, "Well, you probably killed him." Here we are at the Mount Hilo Air Force radar station down near Tillamook on the Oregon coast. And they were in the process of building a new shield over the radar. And again, this is a part of our whole Cold War infrastructure to keep on the lookout for Russian submarines. At the same time, these Air Force stations were valuable for collecting and dispersing weather to the U.S. Weather Bureau at the time, now the U.S. Weather Service. And those discs, you see what's left of what's still on the building and all the framing, that's the kind of the aftermath of the winds, which got up to probably over 150 miles an hour. And it's an inhospitable place even on a nice day. If you do catch it on a clear day, you can see forever. You can see all 5 of the major volcanoes in the Cascade Range and 40, 50 miles south and north up the coast. Pretty spectacular, but you only get that about 8 to 10 days a year. Now we're going to get into a little bit about timber. If you look closely inside the circle, you see a hard hat, a forester with his hard hat on, standing above the ground a good, what do you think, 15, 20 feet. And we had so much timber come down in the Northwest, 15 billion board feet, enough to frame 1 million homes. I'm going to move to another image and then give you a short reading from the book. Here we are in your backyard with a symmetrical Mount St. Helens, but look at that jumble of timber. I'm not sure if this might have been the Toutle drainage, I believe. The amount of timber that came down in the storm was 3 times the volume of the timber we lost when the eruption occurred in 1980. At this point, I'm just going to share with you a little bit from the book. I better find the book that has my notes. Here in Kelso was the home to the Department of Natural Resources. What did they call the district back then? The Kelso District. Yeah, that's what it was called. But the Kelso District, state-owned forest land, had probably the largest holdings of old-growth timber still left in the early 60s. And old growth didn't fare well in the storm. But here's a little excerpt from the fellow that was the manager of the Kelso District. It didn't take long Friday night for Glenn Hawley, management forester for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources Kelso District, to realize the windstorm striking the twin timber towns of Kelso and Longview would be a game changer for him. First, he watched the wind blow out the living room windows of his neighbor's house in Kelso. The single-pane windows found in homes and stores in 1962 were no match for the hurricane-force winds. Then Hawley's thoughts turned to the state forest lands he managed in southwest Washington, a forestry district bordered by U.S. Forest Service and Weyerhaeuser Company land, home to the largest stands of old-growth state timber left in western Washington, much of it east of I-5 in the river valleys flowing off the slopes of the conical-shaped Mount St. Helens. He sensed that the severe windstorm had wreaked havoc on an unprecedented scale. When he woke up Saturday morning from a fitful sleep, he called his boss and said, "I don't suppose I'm going to be going hunting this year." if you recall, Saturday was the opening of deer hunting season. Anyway, he guessed right. He would be preoccupied with timber salvage operations created by the storm for the next 3 years. And then, bear with me just a second, I want to come back to him. I had this marked and I lost one of my stickies. But anyway, the point I wanted to make is that we didn't have enough mill infrastructure in the region to handle all this wood. And it turned out that the Japanese were in the midst of a housing market boom, and they liked hemlock, and we had a lot of hemlock to share, to sell. And as it turns out, the log export market literally grew out of this storm, and it's still with us today, as you well know. Another consequence of this storm was that it led to a mad rush to get this timber out of the forest before a Douglas fir beetle could infest the logs. They had to build thousands and thousands of logging roads that, as if you followed forestry in our region over the last 20, 30 years, you know that a lot of those roads were substandard and have failed and sloughing off into salmon-bearing streams and have led to a big decommissioning effort. So there was a lot of environmental consequence and economic consequence from all that down timber. Well, I had one more thing from Glenn I wanted to share, but I'm not finding it. Anyway, I know what I wanted to tell you. The estimated amount of timber down in the Kelso District was almost 900 million board feet. So to put that in perspective, at the time, during some pretty aggressive logging era, that was 22 times as much timber as they typically harvested out of the Kelso District. So, they were averaging around 40 million board feet a year. And here they are, they wake up Saturday morning with almost 900 million board feet on the ground. So some of these guys I talked to that went out and cruised and set up timber sales talked about being out there walking above the ground all day long. And sometimes they said their feet hardly touched the ground. It was such a jumbled mess. But it's probably one of the largest consequences of the storm is the effect on our timber industry and on our landscape. Here we are out at the Kelso Airport. Planes didn't do very well, and hangars didn't do very well that night. I know that the estimates of planes damaged like these were in southwest Washington and Portland area, up into the Seattle-Tacoma area. Roughly 175 planes were damaged. Hangars were destroyed. There wasn't a lot of air traffic that night. It wasn't a good night to be in the air. But some of these planes lifted off the ground and flew on their own in the height of the storm for up to a mile. Any pilots in the room? I saw a hand start to go up. You weren't flying, were you? Yeah, pretty wild. Okay. We also have some various damage scenes just to share. A little bit of humor, even though it wasn't a funny event, but parked here while shopping, that didn't work out. Anybody's been to the Salem Capitol campus in Oregon may have seen the Circuit Rider statue. That's 3.5-ton statue that was toppled by a falling tree. And then the old Van Buren Bridge in Corvallis, which doesn't look a lot different today than it did then. as I was driving over it last year thinking about this, but you can see the size of that tree that is laying on the ground next to the bridge. That's a pretty mature second growth Doug fir, I believe. Well, here's a fella that, a young boy, and I posed this question, what happened to Charlie? Well, anybody want to take a guess? Nah, no one ever wants to guess. It's a setup question, isn't it? But Charlie, because no one's going to guess unless they've already read the, well, they're not guessing if they've read the book, but Charlie was mauled by an African lion. Now, he was living in Spanaway, 7-year-old boy, and his neighbors had gotten their hands on had two lions as pets, which was not even illegal in our state until 2005, I believe it was, where exotic pet ownership was banned by private parties, unlicensed private parties. But anyway, so they had these two lions in a makeshift enclosure in their backyard. Well, the wind blew the enclosure down. Charlie was outside playing around in the wind in his yard, and one of them pounced on him and mauled him pretty good. His mom and dad kind of, they beat the lion off him. His mom used a slipper and told him to run for the house, and he ran for the house, and the lion chased him and knocked him down again on the stairs. And he finally got in the house, and they finally got him to the hospital, and he got all stitched up, and the doctor said, well, as you can tell by the photo, he's lucky to still have his eyeballs, or he's lucky he didn't go blind. Pretty close call. And he's out in the emergency room lobby, leaving the hospital, and a Tacoma News Tribune reporter showed up and took his picture. And Charlie says, "Are you going to put that in the paper?" And, well, yeah. And he said, "It might make A1. It might be on the front page." And so Charlie got all excited, and then the next day he looked at the paper, and he was on A2, and his mom said he was all bummed out. And then, so Charlie grew up and became a plumber. He works at the Western Washington Fairgrounds in Puyallup. And I interviewed him, I think in the winter of 2012, 2013. And we met at Cabela's, this outdoor store, sporting store in Lacey, and we're in the restaurant cafe upstairs, and 50 feet away, well, maybe not even 20 feet away, was a stuffed African lion. And I go, "Charlie, does that make you nervous looking at those?" Or he goes, "Oh, no, they never bothered me." But I asked his dad, I said, "Well, how was Charlie? How traumatized was he after this?" He goes, "Well, I don't know, but I know one thing, he didn't like large dogs." So, I've got a little story here from your neck of the woods. There was a lot of interesting drama that night, and this one takes place up on Pleasant Hill. So that's just a little north of you here, right? Pleasant Hill? Yeah. Let me find. So the storm is still moving north through southwest Washington, closing in on the population centers of Puget Sound. At the top of Mount Pleasant in rural Kelso, Donald L. Ames, 35, fought his way through the wind from his house to his aluminum barn to rescue a calf, but the storm intervened. Before I go any farther, does anybody know the Ames family?
I know Don Ames.
Did you know Don? I'm probably the same one.
The same one, but I do know Don.
Yeah. So anyway, Don, he was 35, so that would now, he would be 92.
He was pushing 90. So.
Yeah, there you go. It might be Don. So he fought his way through the wind from his house to try to rescue this calf, but a blast of wind toppled the barn, sending timbers and metal crashing down on him. Dazed and bleeding heavily from a scalp wound, he staggered back to his house where he received first aid from his cousin and neighbor, Bob Boone. So Boone set out on foot in the howling winds, heading down Mount Pleasant Road in search of help. The road was a 2.5-mile obstacle course of falling trees and limbs, impassable by vehicle. Boone encountered another neighbor, Phil Jacobs, who had a car at the bottom of the mountain road. The two men hiked to the car and drove to College General Hospital, where they secured a stretcher and assistance from a hospital board member, Donald Van Brunt. The three men headed up the hill with the stretcher. The road had been partially cleared by residents by then, who also loaned the rescuers their cars. Joined by a civil defense crew that was checking the isolated area, they reached the Ames residence at 12:30 that morning, so late night, early morning, more than 6 hours after the accident. By then, the road had been cleared enough for a truck to transport Ames to the hospital. He was treated and reported in satisfactory condition later Saturday. It's possible he could have bled to death without the determined aid of his neighbors and strangers. So there's all sorts of stories like that of neighbors helping neighbors, pitching in, saving lives, cleaning up. Sometimes these natural disasters bring out the best in us. So, doing a little what if here. So what would happen if this storm struck the Pacific Northwest today? Well, on the plus side, we would have a lot more advance notice, days instead of hours, due to the advances in weather forecasting. We have our satellite weather stations orbiting the Earth and sending back images of this vast Pacific Ocean that covers a third of the Earth's surface. Back then, things were brewing out there and no one saw them unless a ship happened to go by them. We have weather buoys out there. We have Doppler radar along the coast. We have a lot going for us now in terms of predicting weather, as we're all, being told to get ready for Snowmageddon, this weekend. But in '62, you didn't get those kind of advance warnings. But on the minus side, look at our population now. It's more than tripled since '62. When I say the region, I'm thinking of the Pacific Northwest. It puts millions more people in harm's way. In the built environment, my goodness, look how it's expanded, which raises the possibility of property damage in the tens of billions of dollars. In our technology and how we depend on it, cell phones and computers, we'd be crippled with power and communication breakdowns. We do not want another storm like this. So that begs the question, what about climate change, and what about the likelihood of these kind of storms? Are we going to see stronger and more frequent non-tropical windstorms? Well, the research doesn't necessarily suggest that for the Pacific Northwest. It's a different story on the East Coast with the Atlantic Ocean and the hurricanes, but these extratropical, non-tropical windstorms that we experience, it's not quite the same projection. The jet stream, the main transport vehicle for these big storms, does appear to be shifting to the north, so we might see a little more activity up our way and a little less in Oregon. So actually southwest Washington probably is more like the Oregon story. It's real hard to tell. There's a lot of computer modeling going on. One of the biggest issues that's making a difference is that the Arctic region, with something called polar amplification, is warming more rapidly than our mid-latitude areas where we live, which reduces some of that extreme temperature differences that fuel the cyclones in the North Pacific Ocean. Now, all that said, no one is saying that we're not going to have a storm like this again, and it's very possible a storm just as powerful could be in our future. So, with that, I'm going to say thank you and ask for questions. Got to be some questions out there.
Do you have any stories about up in the Grace Harbor area, or is that?
Yes, I do have. I have some stories in here from foresters that work in the Grace Harbor area. Hard hit, just like everywhere else. But out there along in the Willapa Hills, a lot of that timber was flattened out there. Yeah.
I lived in Bellingham,
Uh-huh.
and the storm wasn't quite as severe, but we had that. And I was up with a baby all night with an earache, listening to the glass coming off the greenhouses being blown up. But when we moved to Longview 3 years later, every house we looked at, with the purpose of, we want to buy this house, they said, that's a good roof, it went through the Columbus Day storm.
Oh,
That's a new roof, put on
Yeah.
after the Columbus
yeah, they
Day
find
storm.
something good, a real estate agent finding something good to say about either, yeah. Well, yeah, Bellingham was up to 90-mile-an-hour winds. I think Bellingham Bay looked more like the ocean than a bay that night. The Coast Guard boats couldn't get out to help boats out in the bay, and one of the little ferries sank out at Lummi Island. Yeah, Bellingham was hard hit too. Yeah.
You said there was about 45 people died in the storm.
Yeah.
So where was the most of the death at? Was it in Oregon or south of Washington?
It was scattered, but Oregon had over half of the fatalities. There was a large number of fatalities in northern Oregon too. One of the things that happened is that this storm dumped record amounts of rainfall on the Bay Area, Oakland, San Francisco, and the hills to the north and south of the Bay Area. There was massive landslides and flooding. Houses were ripped off their foundation. People were swept away in the mud. There was a lot of car accidents in Northern California. In Oregon, many of the deaths were attributed to falling trees. Trees are the force multiplier for us. They're the things that get us. Cause the damage, cause the fatalities. When you get a big wind ripping through the plains of Nebraska, it's just not the same. Not that you want to be in one of those tornadoes. Yeah. In the back.
What about insurance claims? Did you ever come up with any numbers on the amount of insurance claims?
Yeah, I have some in the book. There was 2 or 3 companies that went bankrupt. They couldn't, they didn't have enough funds to cover the policies that they had. People did have homeowners insurance and they had some coverage. I don't think this was the type of act of God that was exempt from coverage. But a lot of farmers in the Willamette Valley didn't insure their barns, and barns took a real beating. But I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but I have some data in the book about insurance claims.
You said 53,000 homes. There must have been twice that many outcomes in stores.
Yeah, there's a picture in the book of, I know, I wanted to share one more little story with you about, you're right, commercial properties and churches and public buildings were all heavily damaged. Here's a little story from Longview that one of the things about writing a book, you learn that a lot of what you gather gets cut out, right? I have thousands of words of what I thought was interesting stuff that they said, well, that's more than we can publish. So I have all these little anecdotes that didn't get in. Here's one from Longview. Longview was hit hard by the storm. Most of the oak trees in downtown Longview were uprooted or broken. Storefront windows burst and roofs and neon signs flew through the air. Luckily, a 31-year-old interim manager at the downtown Montgomery Ward store had the good sense to open his store to those seeking shelter from the storm. The store was sturdy and well-built, store manager Jim Comstock recalled. Many of the residents of the city took refuge there during the big blow. As a boy growing up in Wisconsin, Comstock had spent many hours in storm cellars when tornadoes rolled through his neck of the woods. His first course of action that fateful Friday night was to keep everyone away from the store's front windows. Although the windows flexed, they didn't break, thank God, he said 50 years later. The crowd waited out the storm, fueled by pop, coffee, and light snacks from the store employee cafeteria. Once the winds subsided, they ventured outside to view destruction everywhere they looked. So those of you who were here know how hard the two cities were hit.
I made the drive from Vancouver to Nacelle that
Ooh.
next Saturday morning,
Yeah?
dodging many trees, but when I came to Longview, where the drive-in theater used to be.
Yeah,
The marquee said, "Gone mit the wind."
yeah. That's right, that's, George Miller told me that story.
And also, the nacelle radar face was similar to the Mount Eagle dome.
Yeah, exactly.
But you mentioned 160 miles an hour. We were told by the Air Force, we were pretty friendly with young fellas.
Uh-huh.
But that wind gauge was broken and bent over at 160.
Yeah, that's,
So there was no way of knowing how much
yeah,
power it was beyond.
that's a tale I heard, not a tale, a fact I heard all up and down the path of the storm, that the anemometers at the Coast Guard stations, the Air Force stations, on the bridge, on the Morrison Avenue Bridge in downtown Portland, all over the place, these things blew away right before they measured the peak gust. Yeah. Yes.
For those of you who walk around Lake Spatula, the Longview Community Church sustained damage at their feet, and when you're walking, you might see there's a difference in the color of the bricks, because some bricks fell down.
Uh-huh.
They couldn't replace the same color as had been done in 1926, and so you have a physical view of what came down.
Right.
at the church.
Yeah, a lot of church steeples toppled in the wind. A lot of brick buildings where the mortar had weakened over time.
On the map that you had at the beginning showing the wind speed,
Uh-huh.
on Vancouver Island,
You want me to go back to it?
it showed 300 mile an hour wind.
No, let's see what we got there.
30 was the zero.
There's, some of the symbols are a little tricky here, but let's get back to it a minute. Okay, so what you have there, that zero is a, what are those little zeros? The graphic artists just used those as to indicate the place where the reading was taken. So that's a 30 and a 25 and a 30. So what we're trying to show is that the storm, this is where the storm died out, on the north central east side of Vancouver Island. It finally ran into enough cool mountain air and the actual physical blockage of the mountains after a 24-hour run. Yeah.
Could you comment a little bit about recovery efforts and what we learned from them and changes we made?
Yeah.
Emergency rooms or law enforcement?
Yeah, yeah. I did try to cover some of that. At the time, our whole emergency management system was essentially civil defense based. We were, in a Cold War, and we're worried about the Russians, and we're worried about atomic bombs and all that drop and cover stuff we did as kids and fallout shelters. Well, in the 60s, with a storm like this and other subsequent natural disasters, including the Alaskan earthquake, Hurricane Camille down south, various big, deadly natural disasters, there started to be a shift away from civil defense toward more emergency management, how to protect yourself during a major wind or storm event. The concept of being able to take care of yourself for up to 72 hours came into play. The idea that everybody should have a transistor radio so they can stay alert to the news. Back then, transistor radios were in their infancy. A lot of people didn't have them. So yeah, the whole thing changed in terms of how we prepare, and in the recovery efforts were actually pretty remarkable in terms of the amount of power outages you're dealing with all up and down the coast. They brought in crews from throughout western United States to help rebuild the lines. I have a figure in here for Longview, the amount of the miles of lines that were down after the storm. I don't know if I could, it'd probably take me too long to find, but So there's all that work going on. The debris, almost every community set up debris collection centers at city parks and county parks, and there was fires going all through the fall and winter, burning debris. People would come and pluck away at it for firewood. McCullough sold more chainsaws the first week after the storm than they typically sell in a year in the Northwest. So there was that kind of cleanup and effort. There was a lot of controversy about the notification system for getting the word out about, some schools let their kids out early and they got home before the storm hit. Down in Oregon where it's midday when the storm hits, or early afternoon. Other schools didn't hear about it and were caught off guard, and school busloads of kids were stranded. I think we learned a lot, and I think it played a role in the shift away from civil defense approach to more of a emergency management approach we have today. Yeah.
I want to make a comment that a couple different things. One is this building area where the museum is, my dad used to own it.
Uh-huh.
And it used to be retail store, but at the time it was just a warehouse, but there was glass in front, all the glass froze. And we found out because somebody came and grabbed 20 fishing poles, and they were walking down the street, and the police officers saw that one, I understand, but 20.
Yeah.
The other thing, I believe it was the next day or the day after, I was in Longview, let's have a real about Elsinore Park. Neighborhood kids, all teenagers, rescue parents went out there to try and help clean the limbs of trees, because the kids get, the roads are closed to the hospital.
Right.
So we're out there, the adults are using chainsaws and we're dragging things off the thing, and all of a sudden we heard this noise, and parents over there, listen, we can stop now, we're going to we got a bulldozer, they're moving them all.
Yeah, there was a lot of looting from storefronts. Remember, double pane windows weren't in vogue yet. Everything was single pane, and a lot of blowouts. I've got a great picture of a Longview storefront in here, courtesy of your museum, a blown out window, and people just stepping over the glass and walking in and grabbing whatever they wanted. Happened all over the region. The governors of Oregon and Washington deployed hundreds of National Guard troops to some of the hardest hit cities to try and curb the looting. Yeah.
I've been told by a few people that the top of the Lewis and Clark Bridge shifted about a foot and a half to go east. It was still
Out of alignment? In Oregon, in Portland, I think 6 out of the 9 bridges that existed at that time were shut down during the storm, and the St. John's Bridge had a 15-foot vertical sway in the bridge deck. Not a good place to be. All right, well, you think we've talked this storm to death here? Well, anyway, I think I'm going to pull up a chair and pull that table over, and I'll hang out. If anybody wants to buy a book, I'd be happy to sell it and sign it.
Thank you, John, for an awesome presentation, and timely too with the upcoming weather that we're expecting. So
Yeah.
I've topped off the tank in my Subaru, so I've got gasoline and all that. Hope you guys are all prepared as well. We also have some forms in the back here. If anybody has any stories, personal stories or accounts of the Columbus Day storm.
Oh, I just thought of something, Joe, I wanted.
Okay.
Excuse me. If anybody, I love hearing the storm stories, and we do have a Facebook group page. The title of it is "A Deadly Wind: The 1962 Columbus Day Storm." OSU Press and I administer the site. If you want to join, just ask, and ask to be invited, and I'll click the button, and you're into the site. You can read other people's stories and share your stories too. It's on Facebook.
Thank you, John. And if you have stories also that you want to share, Danielle has run off some copies of these sheets here. If you want to fill them out, bring them back to the museum. Danielle, they're on the back table. Danielle, are these sheets on the back table? Okay. Great, okay, thank you. And I think that's it. We'll see you all next month on the 7th of March for John Simpson's Civil War letters, third installment. Thank you. Have a good night.